November 14th, 1965. The rhythmic whop-whop-whop of rotor blades cut through the morning mist above landing zone X-ray as 16 Bell UH-1 Iroquois helicopters descended toward a clearing no larger than a football field. Below, hidden in spider holes and camouflaged bunkers, North Vietnamese Army regulars watched the strange mechanical birds with a mixture of curiosity and contempt. This moment would shatter every assumption about modern warfare and transform the jungle battlefields of Vietnam forever. The smell of aviation fuel mixed with wet earth and rotting vegetation as the first Huey touched down, its turboshaft engine whining above the thunderous rotor beat. Dust and debris exploded outward in choking clouds as American soldiers poured from the aircraft's open doors, the acrid smoke of spent tracer rounds already filling their nostrils. The metallic taste of fear hung in the air like morning fog. Just months earlier, in the remote valleys of the Central Highlands, Viet Cong fighters had pointed and laughed at their first glimpse of American helicopters. The ungainly machines seemed absurd to guerrillas who had spent decades perfecting silent movement through jungle trails. Listen to them announce their coming. One NVA company commander had written in his field diary, "The Americans make more noise than a water buffalo stuck in mud. How can such foolish machines be dangerous?" The laughter died that morning at Ia Drang. Before you hear how everything changed, tell us where you're watching from and what time it is there. If you're learning something new about this incredible story, hit that like button and subscribe for more untold military history. Private Levan Duc of the 3rd Battalion, 66th NVA Regiment, crouched in his fighting position as the first wave of Hueys landed. The 22-year-old rice farmer from Vinh Phuc Province had been told by his political officers that American helicopters were propaganda tools, expensive toys that would collapse under real combat conditions. Vietnamese fighters were superior, they said. Patient, disciplined, unafraid of loud machines flown by soft Western pilots. The first indication that something was different came not from the helicopters themselves, but from their cargo. Instead of the confused, frightened conscripts NVA intelligence had described, disciplined soldiers in jungle fatigues moved with practiced efficiency. These were veterans of the 1st Cavalry Division, America's 1st Airmobile Unit, and they deployed from the aircraft like clockwork. Dust off, eagle flight, slicks. The radio chatter meant nothing to Vietnamese ears, but within minutes its significance became terrifyingly clear. A wounded American soldier fell near Le Van Duc's position, struck by rifle fire from a concealed sniper. The soldier's comrades didn't panic or retreat. Instead, they spoke calmly into their radio handsets, using code words that seemed to summon mechanical salvation from the sky. 3 minutes later, the distinctive high-pitched whine of a Lycoming T-53 turboshaft announced the arrival of a medical evacuation helicopter. The Huey settled into the clearing with practiced precision, its crew chief and door gunners providing covering fire with mounted M60 machine guns. The wounded soldier was loaded onto a stretcher and airlifted to a field hospital within 11 minutes of being shot. 11 minutes. In the French War, such a journey would have taken days. Captain Nguyen Van Minh of the 33rd NVA Regiment watched this choreographed rescue with growing unease. His own wounded fighters faced agonizing journeys along jungle trails to reach medical aid. If they reached it at all, many died from infections that American antibiotics could cure in days. Yet here, enemy soldiers received immediate evacuation and advanced surgical care within an hour of injury. The psychological impact was immediate and profound. "We began to understand," Min would write years later, "that we were not fighting an ordinary army. These Americans had broken the ancient rules of warfare. Distance meant nothing to them. Terrain was merely an obstacle to fly over. They could be anywhere, at any time." But the real shock came with the second wave of helicopters. As the medical evacuation lifted off, 16 more Hueys appeared on the horizon, Not transport aircraft this time, but gunships bristling with rocket pods and door-mounted machine guns. The UH-1B and UH-1C variants could transform from cargo haulers to flying artillery platforms in under an hour, their crews adding 2.75-inch folding fin aerial rockets and high rate-of-fire weapons systems. The jungle exploded. Rockets screamed into NVA positions with devastating accuracy, while door gunners raked the tree line with sustained automatic fire. Young Americans, barely 18 years old, straddled plywood seats behind M60 machine guns, their weapons spitting brass casings and tracer rounds into the helicopter's slipstream. The combined roar of engines, rotors, and gunfire created what one survivor described as a mechanical thunderstorm that seemed to tear holes in reality itself. Private Levan Duc pressed his face into the mud as bullets shredded the vegetation around his fighting position. The carefully constructed bunker that had taken weeks to dig offered little protection against aerial attack. Rockets burst overhead, showering his unit with fragments and debris. The noise was overwhelming, disorienting, unlike anything in their training. When the gunships finally departed, an eerie silence settled over the battlefield. But it lasted only moments before a new sound filled the air, the approaching thump, thump, thump of more rotors. The third wave brought reinforcements. Captain Min watched in amazement as fresh American troops landed in the same clearing his unit had just bombarded with mortar fire. The soldiers moved with confidence, quickly establishing a defensive perimeter and calling in coordinates for artillery support. Within 30 minutes of the initial contact, the Americans had transformed a contested landing zone into a fortified position supplied by a steady stream of helicopters. "We had fought the French for 8 years, Min recalled. Their soldiers were brave, but they moved slowly. They needed roads, supply lines, fixed bases. When we cut their communications or blocked their convoys, they became vulnerable. But these Americans, they seemed to appear from thin air." The true genius of American airmobile doctrine wasn't just the helicopters themselves, but the integrated system they represented. Artillery batteries could respond to calls for fire within 3 minutes instead of 30. Medical evacuation reduced casualty mortality rates by 60%. Reinforcements arrived by the battalion instead of by the squad. Most importantly, American commanders could now fight on their own terms. Instead of reacting to guerrilla attacks, they could launch battalion-sized operations deep into enemy territory, forcing NVA and Viet Cong units to fight conventional battles against superior firepower. The transformation was swift and brutal. Villages that had harbored guerrilla fighters for years suddenly found themselves surrounded by American troops who had landed silently at dawn. Supply caches hidden in remote valleys were discovered and destroyed by soldiers who arrived without warning. Safe havens became killing zones. Yet even as the evidence mounted, many Vietnamese fighters refused to believe what they were witnessing. The helicopters were too loud, they argued, too vulnerable, too dependent on complex maintenance and fuel supplies. Surely patient guerrilla fighters could outlast such expensive, high-tech solutions. How wrong they were about to discover they had been. The morning mist had burned away by the time the 16th and final helicopter lifted off from LZ X-ray, carrying the last elements of Lieutenant Colonel Harold Moore's battalion into what would become the most famous helicopter assault in military history. Below, Captain Nguyen Van Min crawled from his damaged bunker and surveyed a battlefield transformed by 30 minutes of American air power. The jungle floor was carpeted with spent brass casings, rocket fragments, and the distinctive smell of burned cordite. Trees stood shattered and stripped of vegetation. The careful camouflage his unit had spent weeks perfecting lay in ruins. But worse than the physical damage was the psychological impact. For the first time in his military career, Min felt hunted instead of hunter. The Americans had demonstrated an ability to strike anywhere, anytime, with overwhelming force. The vast jungle that had always provided sanctuary now seemed small and exposed. The sky belonged to America, as radio reports filtered in from other units across the Central Highlands. A disturbing pattern emerged. Everywhere American helicopters appeared, traditional guerrilla advantages disappeared. Mobility, surprise, and knowledge of local terrain meant nothing when enemy could arrive by air and call down artillery fire within minutes. The laughter had stopped. In its place came a cold realization that would reshape Vietnamese strategy for the remainder of the war. The Americans hadn't just brought better weapons to Vietnam. They had brought a completely different way of fighting. The screaming began at 0430 hours on November 16th. Specialist Tommy Morrison of Charlie Company pressed his face against the mud-slicked floor of his foxhole as automatic weapons fire raked the perimeter. The distinctive crack of AK-47 rifles mixing with the deeper thump of mortars. Around him, wounded soldiers called for medics, their voices barely audible above the chaos of a pre-dawn assault gone wrong. What happened next would prove that American air power could turn certain death into miraculous salvation in under 60 seconds. Morrison's platoon had been cut off for 18 hours, surrounded by an estimated 2 companies of NVA regulars who had learned to attack at night when helicopters couldn't fly. The traditional rules still applied in darkness. Wounded soldiers died slowly, ammunition ran low, and isolated units faced annihilation without hope of reinforcement. The Vietnamese fighters had chosen their moment perfectly. Or so they thought. The first sound wasn't the rotors. It was the high-pitched whine of a Lycoming T-53 turboshaft engine, barely audible above the gunfire, but unmistakable to anyone who had served in Vietnam. Somewhere in the black sky above the jungle canopy, a UH-1 pilot was making the kind of approach that training manuals said was impossible. Staff Sergeant Miguel Santos, Morrison's squad leader, later described the moment in a letter home. "We heard that beautiful engine whine and knew the cavalry was coming. Didn't matter that it was darker than the inside of a coffin or that Charlie was throwing everything at us. Somebody up there was about to risk his neck to get us out." Night medevac operations violated every principle of helicopter safety. Pilots flew without landing lights to avoid drawing fire, navigating by compass and radio beacons toward landing zones marked only by flashlights and chemical glow sticks. Rotor clearance was measured in inches, not feet. One miscalculation meant crashing into trees or power lines, killing crew and patients alike. Yet by late 1965, dust-off crews were attempting night extractions that French pilots would have considered suicidal. The psychological impact on ground troops was immeasurable. Soldiers who had accepted death as inevitable suddenly heard the rhythmic whop-whop-whop of approaching rotors and knew they might live to see morning. The siren of salvation. Chief Warrant Officer David Chen had been flying medevac missions for 8 months when his UH-1D received the emergency call from Charlie Company. The radio transmission was brief and desperate. "Dust off, dust off. We have 8 urgent surgical and multiple routine. Coordinates follow. Heavy contact. LZ is hot. Hot LZ. Enemy fire confirmed at the pickup site." Chen's crew consisted of 3 other men, barely out of their teens. Specialist Robert Martinez, the medic, had turned 19 2 weeks earlier. Door gunners, Private First Class James Wilson and Private Danny Kim were 20 and 18 respectively. Their combined combat experience totaled less than 2 years. Yet they were about to attempt a rescue that would have challenged veteran crews. The approach began 3 miles out, flying nap of the earth through valleys and ridgelines to avoid detection. The Huey's rotor tips cleared treetops by mere feet, the aircraft bucking and sliding in the turbulent air that hugged the jungle canopy. Through his night vision scope, Chen could see muzzle flashes ahead. The battle was still raging. 1 mile out, the crew began their final approach checklist. Martinez prepared stretchers and medical supplies, while Wilson and Kim checked their M60 machine guns, loading belt after belt of ammunition. Standard loadout called for 500 rounds per gun, but experienced crews had learned to carry 2,000 rounds in expanded ammunition cans for sustained suppressive fire. At 500 meters, Chen switched on the aircraft's landing light. The jungle exploded with enemy fire. Tracer rounds streaked past the cockpit as NVA fighters concentrated their weapons on the approaching helicopter. Chen felt the familiar thunk of small arms rounds hitting the fuselage, praying none would find vital components. A single round in the tail rotor control or hydraulic lines would turn rescue into catastrophe. Private Wilson opened fire with his door-mounted M60, the weapon spitting flame and brass casings into the night. The sustained hammering of the machine gun mixed with the rotor noise to create what ground troops called mechanical thunder, a sound that meant American firepower was arriving. But the real shock came from below. As Chen flared the Huey for landing, his rotor wash revealed the true scope of the night battle. The LZ was smaller than a tennis court, surrounded by enemy positions dug into the jungle floor. Muzzle flashes winked from spider holes and camouflaged bunkers that formed a nearly complete circle around the trapped Americans. The Vietnamese fighters had set a perfect ambush, except they hadn't counted on vertical evacuation. Specialist Morrison crawled toward the helicopter through a chaos of flying dirt and debris. The rotor downwash turned the landing zone into a tornado of mud, leaves, and spent cartridge cases. The metallic taste of cordite, mixing with the smell of aviation fuel and hot hydraulic fluid. Above the noise, he could hear Martinez shouting instructions to the wounded. Move, 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 get them on board. The loading took 90 seconds. 8 wounded soldiers, some conscious, others barely clinging to life, were lifted into the aircraft's cramped cabin. Morrison helped load his squad leader, Santos, whose leg had been shattered by mortar fragments. As the medic worked to stabilize Santos with field dressings and morphine, the helicopter began its vertical ascent. The NVA fighters emptied their magazines at the departing aircraft. Green tracers streaked past the windows as Chen pushed the aircraft to its maximum rate of climb, the overloaded Huey struggling in the humid night air. Through the open doors, Morrison could see muzzle flashes receding below like dying stars. 7 minutes after touchdown, the medevac was airborne and headed for the 3rd Surgical Hospital at Bien Hoa. 7 minutes from certain death to medical evacuation. Santos would walk with a slight limp for the rest of his life, but he would walk. The psychological transformation was immediate and profound. Captain Pham Van Dong of the 32nd NVA Regiment had planned the ambush for 3 weeks, positioning his fighters to annihilate an isolated American unit using classic guerrilla tactics. The night attack had proceeded flawlessly until the helicopter arrived. In 90 seconds, his tactical victory had become a strategic failure. We had them surrounded, outnumbered, nearly out of ammunition, he wrote in his post-action report. But the Americans simply flew away from defeat. How do you fight an enemy who refuses to accept the rules of battle? The question haunted Vietnamese commanders across the Central Highlands. Traditional ambush tactics assumed that surrounded units would fight to the death or attempt breakout attacks. American forces did neither. They called for helicopters and disappeared into the sky, leaving behind only empty positions and the smell of aviation fuel. More disturbing was the speed of American reinforcement. Within hours of the failed ambush, 2 full companies of the 1st Cavalry Division had been inserted into landing zones around Captain Dong's position. The hunters had become the hunted, forced to abandon carefully prepared positions and retreat deeper into the jungle. Radio intercepts revealed the scale of Vietnamese concern. NVA field commanders began issuing urgent orders to avoid open clearings during daylight hours. Ambush positions that had been effective for months were abandoned overnight. Supply routes that had operated safely for years were rerouted to avoid areas where helicopters might land. The adaptation was swift, but costly. Supply lines became longer and more vulnerable. Communications took days instead of hours. Fighting positions had to be constructed with overhead cover, reducing fields of fire. Most importantly, the initiative had passed to American forces who could strike anywhere at any time. Yet even as evidence mounted, some Vietnamese leaders refused to acknowledge the transformation. Senior Colonel Tran Van Tra, commanding NVA forces in the Central Highlands, dismissed helicopter warfare as American showmanship, expensive, but ultimately ineffective against determined guerrilla fighters. His confidence would be tested within weeks. December brought the monsoon season, turning landing zones into quagmires and helicopter operations into exercises in controlled catastrophe. Spinning rotors drove mud into engines and sensors, while aircraft returned to base camps with brown streaks along their fuselages. Visibility dropped to near zero during tropical downpours. The Americans kept flying anyway. Chief Warrant Officer Chen found himself making approaches in weather that grounded commercial aviation. Rain drummed against the cockpit windows, while the Huey bucked and skittered through turbulent air. Landing zones became mud-slicked nightmares where rotor wash created instant swamps, trapping aircraft until they could gain enough power to break free. "We flew in weather that would kill a bird," Chen wrote to his wife. "Rain so thick you couldn't see the ground until you hit it. Winds that threw the helicopter around like a toy. But we kept going because soldiers on the ground were counting on us." The psychological impact on Vietnamese forces was devastating. American helicopters operated in conditions that seemed impossible: darkness, storms, enemy fire, terrain that defied conventional aircraft. The mechanical limitations that Vietnamese planners had counted on simply didn't apply. Nothing stopped the Americans. By January 1966, NVA tactical doctrine had been completely rewritten. Ambush positions required multiple escape routes and overhead concealment. Artillery pieces were moved daily to avoid helicopter-delivered counter-battery fire. Supply convoys traveled only at night and in weather too severe for air operations. Most significantly, Vietnamese forces began concentrating automatic weapons and rocket-propelled grenades specifically to engage helicopters. If American air power couldn't be avoided, it would have to be destroyed. The war was about to enter a new and deadlier phase, where mechanical salvation would be measured not in seconds, but in the courage of young men willing to fly into hell to bring their comrades home. But first, the Americans would demonstrate just how far their helicopter revolution could reach and what it would cost both sides when the sky became the primary battlefield. February 20th, 1966. The sharp crack of a rocket-propelled grenade split the morning air above landing zone Albany as Senior Lieutenant Hoang Van Tai sighted down the length of his RPG-7, watching a UH-1 Huey settle into its final approach. The helicopter's rotor wash kicked up clouds of red dust and dried vegetation, the familiar mechanical thunder of turboshaft engines and spinning blades announcing another American insertion. This time, the Vietnamese were ready. The revolution in helicopter warfare had forced both sides to evolve, and evolution in combat meant learning to kill more efficiently. Thai's rocket streaked toward the descending aircraft, its shape-charged warhead designed specifically to penetrate helicopter armor. Around him, his squad opened fire with concentrated automatic weapons, their AK-47 rifles and machine guns focused on the vulnerable moment when American helicopters hovered motionless during touchdown. The lessons of Ia Drang had been absorbed by Vietnamese commanders. If helicopters couldn't be avoided, they had to be destroyed. The RPG missed by inches, exploding against a tree trunk 50 meters behind the Huey. But the psychological message was clear. The sky was no longer safe for American aircraft. Chief Warrant Officer Michael Rodriguez felt the concussion wave rock his UH-1 as shrapnel peppered the fuselage. His door gunner, Specialist Tony Kowalski, returned fire with sustained bursts from his M60, the weapon's rapid hammering, mixing with the screams of wounded soldiers in the cabin behind him. Through the chaos, Rodriguez could hear his crew chief shouting updates on aircraft damage over the intercom. Taking fire from 3 o'clock. Hydraulic pressure dropping. The Huey shuddered as small arms rounds found their mark. Rodriguez fought to maintain control as the aircraft's flight characteristics changed, hydraulic fluid spraying across the windscreen in thin red streams. The smell of hot metal and burning oil filled the cockpit, mixing with cordite smoke and the acrid stench of fear sweat from his crew. But the most devastating change wasn't mechanical, it was tactical. Listen to that silence. Where once Vietnamese fighters had fled at the sound of approaching helicopters, now they stayed and fought. Ambush positions included dedicated anti-aircraft teams, armed with heavy machine guns and rocket launchers. Supply routes were protected by overlapping fields of fire, designed to create helicopter killing zones. Most ominously, entire NVA companies were being equipped and trained specifically to engage American air mobile operations. Captain Lamin Duke of the 95th NVA Regiment had spent 3 months studying captured American field manuals, learning the patterns and procedures of helicopter operations. Landing zones, he discovered, were predictable. Pilots preferred certain types of terrain and avoided others. Flight paths followed geographic features. Most importantly, helicopters were vulnerable during specific phases of their missions. The Americans had become dependent on their flying machines, he wrote in his tactical assessment. Like opium addicts, they could not function without their helicopters. This dependence was also their weakness. Duke's analysis proved prophetic. By spring 1966, American helicopter losses were mounting at alarming rates. UH-1 aircraft that had seemed invulnerable during the early months of air mobile operations were being shot down with increasing frequency. Experienced crews were being killed or wounded faster than replacements could be trained. The war in the air was becoming as brutal as the war on the ground. Specialist Rodriguez managed to coax his damaged Huey back to Firebase Charlie, hydraulic fluid streaming from bullet holes in the aircraft's belly. As the helicopter settled onto the landing pad, ground crews swarmed the aircraft, assessing damage and preparing repairs. The fuselage was riddled with small-caliber holes, the tail boom showed stress fractures, and the main rotor showed signs of battle damage. "She'll fly again," announced Sergeant First Class Bobby Martinez, the crew chief responsible for keeping the squadron's aircraft operational. "But it's going to take 3 days, and a miracle." 3 days. In the early months of helicopter operations, battle damage had been rare enough that a single hit constituted major news. Now, aircraft returned from missions looking like Swiss cheese, their crews matter-of-fact about receiving enemy fire. The psychological transformation was complete. Flying into combat had become routine, expected, almost mundane. But the cost was becoming unbearable. The crew quarters at Firebase. Charlie told the story in photographs and empty bunks. Pictures of young men who would never see home again lined the walls of the Quonset huts where helicopter crews tried to sleep between missions. Some had been shot down in flames, others had crashed during night approaches, still others had simply disappeared into the jungle during routine supply runs. Door gunner Tony Kowalski, 19 years old and 3,000 miles from his home in Detroit, wrote to his girlfriend, "The life expectancy of a door gunner is about as long as a lit match in a hurricane. Every day we go up, and every day we wonder if we're coming back. But we keep going because the guys on the ground are counting on us." The mathematics were brutal but simple. American helicopter crews were flying 8 to 10 missions per day during major operations, accumulating combat flight hours faster than any air crew in military history. Some crew chiefs logged over 1,500 combat hours in a single tour, equivalent to several careers of peacetime flying compressed into 12 months of continuous operations. How long could men endure such intensity? The answer came in the form of 1,000-yard stares and shaking hands, symptoms of combat exhaustion that medical officers were seeing with increasing frequency. Helicopter crews, who had seemed invincible during the early months of airmobile operations, were breaking down under the relentless stress of daily combat flights. Yet they kept flying. Because American soldiers on the ground depended on them, and because the alternative abandoning airmobile operations was unthinkable to commanders who had witnessed their effectiveness. The Vietnamese, meanwhile, were adapting with deadly efficiency. Senior Colonel Vo Nguyen Giap, commanding NVA forces in Military Region 4, issued new tactical guidelines. In March 1966, helicopter landing zones were to be pre-surveyed and prepared as killing fields. Anti-aircraft weapons would be concentrated at likely insertion points. Most importantly, Vietnamese forces would no longer retreat from helicopter assaults. They would stand and fight, accepting casualties in exchange for shooting down American aircraft. The results were immediate and devastating. Helicopter losses doubled, then tripled as Vietnamese forces implemented their new anti-aircraft doctrine. American pilots, who had grown accustomed to uncontested landings, suddenly found themselves flying into prepared ambushes where every tree line concealed automatic weapons. Private First Class Danny Kim, door gunner on Rodriguez's crew, experienced the new reality during a routine supply mission to Fire Support Base Alpha. As their UH-1D approached the landing zone, Kim spotted muzzle flashes from multiple positions surrounding the LZ, a coordinated ambush designed specifically to trap helicopters. "Braking left," Rodriguez shouted over the intercom as tracer rounds streaked past the cockpit. The Huey banked sharply, its rotor disc presenting a smaller target profile as the pilot attempted to break contact. Behind them, Kim could see other helicopters taking fire, their door gunners returning suppressive fire with everything they had. But the Vietnamese had learned to lead their targets, to fire where the helicopters would be rather than where they were. Green tracers converged on the flight path like deadly mathematics, forcing pilots into increasingly desperate evasive maneuvers. The sky had become a battlefield. What followed would test American air mobile doctrine to its breaking point and force both sides to confront the true cost of vertical warfare. The helicopter revolution that had seemed so promising just months earlier was about to face its greatest challenge, an enemy that refused to be intimidated by mechanical thunder and was learning to kill the machines that had once seemed invincible. The question was no longer whether helicopters could change the nature of warfare, but whether their crews could survive long enough to make the change permanent. June 15, 1967. The pre-dawn darkness above Firebase Bravo shattered as 24 UH-1D helicopters materialized from the jungle mist, their synchronized rotor beats creating a mechanical symphony that announced the arrival of an entire battalion. Below, Captain Nguyen Van Quang of the 18th NVA Regiment pressed his face against the mud floor of his bunker, feeling the vibrations of approaching aircraft through the earth beneath his chest. After 2 years of adaptation, evolution, and brutal learning, both sides had reached a terrible equilibrium in the sky. The helicopters that descended toward LZ Whiskey that morning were different from the aircraft that had first shocked Vietnamese fighters at Ia Drang. These Hueys bore the scars of prolonged combat, patched bullet holes, reinforced armor plating, and the kind of field modifications that only came from surviving hundreds of missions under fire. Their crews moved with the mechanical precision of men who had learned to function in a state of controlled terror. This was no longer innovation. This was industrial warfare. Door gunner specialist James Washington, flying his 200th combat mission, no longer flinched at the sound of incoming rounds. The metallic ping of bullets striking the fuselage had become as routine as the taste of cordite and aviation fuel that permanently coated his mouth. Around his position, sandbags and plywood armor provided protection that early crews had never enjoyed. Improvements written in blood and learned through loss. But the real evolution was invisible, coded in radio frequencies and tactical procedures that had been refined through months of combat. American helicopter operations had become a science of controlled violence, where every variable, from weather to enemy response, was calculated, anticipated, and countered. The Vietnamese had evolved too. Captain Quang's anti-aircraft section included weapons that hadn't existed in 1965. 12.7 millimeter heavy machine guns, specifically positioned to engage helicopters, RPG-7 rocket launchers with high explosive rounds, and most importantly, tactics developed through bitter experience. His fighters no longer scattered at the sound of rotors. They waited, aimed, and fired with the patience of men who understood their enemy's vulnerabilities. The morning's battle would demonstrate just how far both sides had traveled from those first chaotic encounters in the Central Highlands. As the lead Huey flared for landing, Quang's gunners opened fire with devastating coordination. Heavy machine gun rounds tore through rotor blades, while RPG rounds streaked toward the most vulnerable targets. Helicopters caught in the hover, unable to maneuver, loaded with troops who represented months of training and millions of dollars in equipment. But the American response revealed the true sophistication of air-mobile warfare by 1967. Before the Vietnamese gunners could reload, suppressive fire erupted from escort helicopters circling overhead. UH-1C gunships, armed with M75 grenade launchers and M134 miniguns, delivered precise fire on predetermined targets, while transport aircraft completed their insertions under covering fire. Artillery coordinators aboard command helicopters called in fire missions that bracketed enemy positions within 60 seconds of first contact. The sky had become a killing machine. Specialist Washington watched tracer rounds streak past his door gun position as his pilot, Chief Warrant Officer Robert Chen, survivor of over 300 combat missions, maneuvered their Huey through the chaos with supernatural skill. The aircraft bucked and twisted through the air, its engines screaming at maximum power, while Chen used every ridge, tree line, and depression to mask their approach. 30 seconds to LZ. Chen announced over the intercom as small arms fire intensified around them. Behind Washington, 8 soldiers from the 1st Cavalry Division prepared for combat insertion, their faces reflecting the mixture of fear and determination that characterized infantry about to enter battle by helicopter. These weren't the confused, frightened conscripts that NVA intelligence reports had described in 1965. 2 years of helicopter warfare had produced a generation of American soldiers who moved through vertical space as naturally as their fathers had moved across open ground. They understood rotor wash, ammunition loads, and the precise timing required to exit an aircraft under fire. The landing took 43 seconds. 43 seconds, during which Chen held his aircraft motionless while soldiers poured from the doors, their boots hitting red dirt that exploded upward in clouds of dust and debris. Washington's M60 hammered steadily, its barrel glowing cherry red as he poured suppressive fire into suspected enemy positions. Then they were airborne again, climbing at maximum rate through a curtain of small arms fire toward the relative safety of altitude. Captain Quang watched the helicopters disappear into morning haze with the resignation of a man who had witnessed this choreographed violence hundreds of times. His carefully prepared ambush had inflicted minimal damage on the American insertion while exposing his own positions to devastating counterfire. 2 of his anti-aircraft crews were dead, their positions obliterated by helicopter-delivered rockets. Yet his soldiers had stood and fought, accepting casualties in exchange for the psychological victory of shooting back. The Americans might own the sky, but they no longer owned it unopposed. The true measure of helicopter warfare's evolution lay not in tactical victories or defeats, but in the grinding mathematics of attrition. By mid-1967, American forces were losing approximately 1 helicopter per 1,000 flight hours, a rate that made air mobile operations sustainable but expensive in both machines and men. Vietnamese losses were harder to quantify, but no less real. Entire companies had been destroyed by helicopter-delivered assaults they couldn't escape. Supply routes had been interdicted by air mobile forces that appeared without warning in previously secure areas. Most critically, the psychological advantage that had sustained guerrilla operations for decades was gone. American forces could strike anywhere, anytime, with devastating effectiveness. Both sides had learned to live with mechanical thunder. The final evolution came in the form of mutual adaptation. American pilots developed low-level flying techniques that minimized exposure to ground fire while maximizing their ability to deliver troops and supplies. Vietnamese fighters learned to position anti-aircraft weapons where helicopters were most vulnerable while accepting that some operations would succeed despite their best efforts. By late 1967, helicopter warfare in Vietnam had reached a state of deadly equilibrium. Neither side could eliminate the other's capabilities, but both had learned to function within the new reality of vertical battlefield. Specialist Washington completed his tour in December 1967 with over 1,500 combat flight hours and 3 Purple Hearts. His replacement, Specialist Michael Torres from San Antonio, Texas, arrived with training that Washington's generation had learned through trial and error. The institutional knowledge of helicopter combat was now passed down through formal instruction rather than battlefield experience. Captain Quang was killed in March 1968 during a helicopter assault on his base camp. His replacement, Lieutenant Tran Van Duke, inherited tactical doctrine that Quang's generation had developed through bitter experience. The same institutional learning that characterized American forces was occurring within Vietnamese ranks. The helicopter revolution that had begun with shocked laughter at whopping rotors had become the defining characteristic of modern warfare. Both sides had learned to kill and survive in three-dimensional battle space where altitude provided advantage and rotor noise announced death. 25 years later, veterans of both armies would describe the distinctive sound of UH-1 rotors with the same mixture of fear and nostalgia. For Americans, it remained the siren of salvation, the sound that meant rescue, reinforcement, and survival. For Vietnamese fighters, it became sky thunder, the mechanical heartbeat of an enemy that could appear anywhere. The true victory belonged neither to American technology nor Vietnamese adaptation, but to the young men who learned to function in a form of warfare that had never existed before and would never exist again. They had written the book on helicopter combat with their blood, courage, and stubborn refusal to accept defeat. The thunder never stopped. It simply became part of the permanent soundtrack of modern war. In dusty museums and quiet ceremonies today, the whop-whop-whop of restored Huey rotors still draws crowds of gray-haired men who straighten unconsciously at the sound. Some wore olive drab, others black pajamas. All learned the same lesson in the skies above Vietnam. When warfare becomes vertical, courage is measured not in distance covered, but in altitude maintained under fire. The helicopter revolution was complete. The sky would never be the same.